Good afternoon and welcome to the October 21st meeting of the Rotary Club of Des Moines. I am President Catherine Staub and I am delighted to see all of you here today, especially since it's gotten a little blustery outside. Thank you to Ganesh and Pat for signing up to give a moment of inspiration, followed by the pledge and a four-way test. Ganesh?
Thank you, President Catherine. At this point in time, it's important to take a moment as we do a moment of inspiration. And you know, I'm used to the old school when we used to come up and maybe say a prayer, but I wanted to approach this a little bit differently today. So as we think about prayer, it usually comes at a time where we recognize that we need a higher power to intervene. Sometimes we need strength to help us through something. Many times we must humble ourselves and remember the world does not begin or end with us. When we pray, we surrender control and we communicate our real feelings about a situation. What should inspire us is that when we take that first step to pray, we basically are seeking answers, and we know we're going to get those answers, and it may not always reveal the way that we're seeking, but those answers are usually in front of us. Sometimes we find ourselves in contentment with life, meaning we may not be really seeking prayer, so I often say to people at that time, give praise. So sometime today I empower you to go in prayer or in praise. Please join me in the Pledge of Allegiance.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
And now the four-way test. Is it the
Truth, is it fair to all concerned? Will it build goodwill and better friendships? Will it be beneficial to all concerned?
Now warmly, virtually greet each other from a distance.
I have absolutely no special announcements to make today, so you don't get me up here very long. So with that, actually, I will turn it, okay, did I hear clapping over there? Someone clapped. Doug Saltzgaber. No. So with this, I will turn it over to past President Sean Mullen, who is going to introduce our program for today. Sean?
Friends, it's officially fall. I put my socks back on. Many of you don't know that as past president, you have the high honor of going sockless to Rotary meetings. I don't know what Doug is wearing today, and I don't know what Jamie's wearing today, and I don't see Steve here. Check out Steve. He usually goes sockless most of the time. Something to be aware of. Fellow Rotarians and friends, Rotary is a global network of 1.2 million neighbors, friends, leaders, and problem solvers who see the world where people unite and take action to create lasting change across the globe, in our communities, and in ourselves. Rotary members believe that we have a shared responsibility to take action on our world's most potent issues. Our 35,000 plus clubs work together to promote peace, fight disease, provide clean water, sanitation, and hygiene, save mothers and children, support education, and grow local economies. Now, today's speaker is the embodiment of these very tenets of our Rotary way. In fact, you could say he's come home to roost. A fellow Rotarian who's returning to Des Moines after time in Nebraska with the Center for Rural Affairs, our speaker will share his new venture and the return of the Des Moines Lyceum after a century hiatus. A tradition in Des Moines since 1851, the Lyceum is a place for us to get offline and get into a room together and talk about big ideas. It hosts lectures and conversations from leading thinkers and doers. It provides a space for neighbors and friends to talk about the meaningful questions we all have in philosophy, history, government, culture, and more. Does that sound like a recipe for success? Please join me in welcoming a local son done good and a Rotarian who will be joining our club, Nathan DeHaan. Nathan?
Thank you very much, Sean, for that generous introduction. I knew when I got the welcome email from Sean how high energy it was that this was going to be a good club to join. I'm going to pass around these papers real quickly. If we won't take too long. Actually, you can just have sure. Yep, thank you. Yeah, so as Sean said, I am originally from Des Moines. I was born in Sioux City, but grew up here in Des Moines. I went to college at the University of St. Thomas in St. Paul, Minnesota, to study philosophy. And it wasn't really until my fourth year that my advisors decided to inform me that it's kind of a bear market on philosophers. So I had to look for another route and a way to use those kind of critical thinking skills and that interest in the common good. And that led me into politics. And through some circuitous routes out to DC, where I worked in the think tank for a couple of years. And what I experienced in DC, as you can kind of imagine, is that things are incredibly siloed right now between political identities. If you are Republican, you go to Republican bars and you consume Republican news and you hang out with Republicans. If you're a Democrat, you do the same. And so that was sort of a frustrating thing, and it was kind of hard to tell what good was being done through some of this think tank stuff, so I wanted to come back to the Midwest, which had always been my goal, and to work on kind of a more concrete level. So for the past several years, I've been at the Center for Rural Affairs in Nebraska, where I advocate for small towns and small farms and rural interests in general. But even back, in a small town like Lyons, it's a town of 800 where our office was, you still see some of these same types of things where people only associate with people who think like themselves, and we have more and more difficulty talking to each other as human beings across those differences. And so that experience is one of the things that caused me to kind of take the leap on this idea that I've had for many years to start the Lyceum, or to resurrect it here in Des Moines. And I'll see if I'm smart enough to work the clicker with Kitty's help. So, what is the problem that the Lyceum is trying to address? I kind of hinted at it, but in general, beyond this idea of just polarization, we don't talk like we used to. Americans spoke to their neighbors at least a few times a month. This difference between 2008 and 2017, that is, just in that short period of less than 10 years, was cut in half. And this is true across all kinds of measures. There was a recent survey from the Survey Center on American Life that showed that men in America are 5 times less likely to have a best friend than they were in the 90s. People are less likely to have people over for dinner. You're less likely to have family dinner. People are less likely than ever to know their neighbors' names. Okay, so that's one reality that we're encountering. And because of this, because we don't know each other, we don't share life with each other in the same way, we don't trust each other. This is the difference between this decade that we just closed in the 70s of Americans who trust their neighbors to make good decisions in government, that ticker in 1974 is upwards of 80%, and now it's below 60%, so another significant decline. And in addition to that, we don't do activities together in the way that we used to. You can see across all these different kinds of social organizations, attendance and membership is down. Service clubs, you can see, have managed to maintain a bit of positive growth, but almost everything else is down. And that's true across all kinds of measures: church, temple, mosque attendance, community sports, community organizations, civic participation, and local government. It's down across pretty much every metric. And so the result of that is a number of things. Polarization and political radicalization being among the first and foremost. And the reason that happens without social trust, without being in constant interaction with your neighbors who think differently than you, who can call BS on your ideas and you can call BS on their ideas, and be sitting at the bar with somebody who has a totally different framework than you that can temper and you can moderate each other. We consume our ideas online. And online, we are able to self-select people who already think like us, and the algorithms are designed to give us more of what we already like and agree with. So the more time that you engage with ideas online or through mass media, it's likely you're just going to become more of what you already are, rather than being able to see nuance or things that could be true in somebody else's opinion. And then loneliness and depression. If we're not spending time with each other, if we're not sharing life with our neighbors, we don't have a sense of where we fit in with the community. And likes and hearts or whatever you get on TikTok, I don't know, doesn't substitute for friendship or for knowing your neighbor and being able to count on them when something goes wrong. And then finally, these ideas of lack of meaning and decline of local solidarity. Meaningful life has to do with being in a community that has a shared sense of what the meaning of our life together is. And then having a sense of what your role is in achieving that shared sense of meaning. And so if we don't have a strong community, we don't have a way to orient people according to how they should be spending their life. And that can result in people searching for significance in ways that are not healthy. And so, there's a remedy to this in our history, and it's called the Lyceum. It was founded by a farmer named Josiah Holbrook in 1826, who believed that ideas didn't just belong in Harvard or Yale or Brown or whatever, but belonged to farmers and mechanics and working people, and that those people and Americans generally, in order to be good citizens and participate in self-government, had to develop their minds, had to become more knowledgeable, had to learn how to talk together and disagree together productively, and to develop the qualities of good judgment and wisdom that would make them good judges of how to govern themselves. At the movement's height, from that little farmstead in Connecticut, it took off, spread off across New England and the Northeast, and then really rooted in the Midwest. And there were over 3,000 at the height of the movement. The Lyceum in Des Moines was founded here, almost when the town was founded in 1851 as the Fort Des Moines Lyceum. And at the time, especially after the war, when the African American community in Des Moines grew larger, there was a Lyceum that came out of that community. And it was really the seedbed of cultural creation and poetry and music in the black community in Des Moines at that time. You can go back and look at the Iowa Bystander, which is the black paper at that time, and see reports of all of these things that are being done through the Lyceum in Des Moines each week. And so it was the case that this was just where the community came to think together, to solve problems together, to pursue wisdom together. And so if you were somebody who was a public figure who had an idea to expound, the place you would do it is the Lyceum. Frederick Douglass, when he made his argument against slavery, was making it at the Lyceum, including Lyceums in Iowa. Susan B. Anthony, when she was making her argument for suffrage, was doing it at the Lyceum. Alexander Graham Bell, when he debuted the telephone, he took that first phone call at the Lyceum. So it was really where everything was happening at that time, and we'll go to the next one, Steve. Abraham Lincoln's first ever public address was given at the Lyceum, at the Illinois Young Men's Lyceum, to be specific. And it's a famous speech, too, and this is just a selection from it here. He said, "If destruction be our lot, we must ourselves be its author and finisher. Sober reason must furnish all the materials for our future support and defense. Let those materials be molded into general intelligence and and sound morality. And so what he means by that is our position where we are in the world, and this is especially true in his time, is a protected position. We're surrounded by oceans. We have nearly boundless natural resources and a strong, flawed but strong system of government. And so he thought if our destruction of our country was going to happen, it was going to come through the decay of the character of the people who live here. And the sense that we're not engaged in a common project anymore, and the inability to talk and reason fruitfully together. And so that's what the Lyceum is actually all about, is trying to build and develop those things. The Lyceum flourished throughout the 19th century, but it started to fade away as mass media came about, specifically radio and the papers. And there was a big change in the way that communities were shaped at that time. And this is a tie-in to Rotary clubs. If you look at the strength of social ties and community bonds over the last century, you'll see a bell curve like that. So things were very low at the turn of the century when Rotary was founded. Because of urbanization, changing ways of work, and because of the ethic of social Darwinism, survival of the fittest, that was a time of great individualism in our country. And Rotary was founded, as well as these other service groups and fraternal groups, out of a conscious effort to reform the conscience of the country. And so if you look at the four-way test, it's there as kind of a creed of community focus rather than self-focus, not thinking of myself, but thinking of the broader community. And so the miraculous thing is that this grassroots effort at social change and moral reform worked. It wasn't a policy from Washington. It wasn't a theory from Harvard. It was just people in the Midwest and elsewhere getting together and deciding that something needed to change. And so you see the height of that bell curve in the mid-century, in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, and then you see a precipitous decline to now. And the hopeful part about that, the unhopeful part, obviously, the downward slope. The hopeful part is that this is not a thing of necessity. It changes, and we can change it. People, like the people in this room, obviously are committed to those principles of Rotary and can change it. And so at this time, the Lyceum starts to fade out because of these other ways of engaging with ideas through radio or the papers or whatever, and the birth of television. But in Des Moines, it was decided that something like this should come back. And so the superintendent of public schools, John W. Studebaker, created this idea for the Des Moines Public Forum. And he thought we had this infrastructure with the public schools that we're using to educate kids, but we're not using it in the evenings and we're not using it for adults. And that adults need that continued education and development of the mind. You don't just end when you're done with high school or college. And so these are some of the posters that are from the early 1930s, and these are the things they talked about: a personal philosophy for this time, are we done with democracy, questions that you'll hear people asking today. And then practical questions, like this one, Smoke over Des Moines, of how they brought up the St. Louis Smoke Commissioner because St. Louis had cleared up its sky, about how they could clear up the sky in Des Moines. And it was a wildly successful thing. And there were, they record 60,000 adults in Des Moines who participated in these forums in the first year, which is a pretty remarkable thing if you think about the population of what Des Moines was in the 30s. And it took off so gangbusters that it got installed in the FDR administration. It was part of the WPA. And they created this core of forum leaders, and it spread across the country, and there were millions of Americans participating in these things and discussing these ideas of how to live well as a community, how to work for the common good. And it only ended because World War II came around, and some people thought it would be better to spend money on tanks than on ideas, and that carried the day. So after that, things only get worse as far as this idea of we're not engaging with ideas with our neighbors anymore, we're engaging with them through mass media. You have TV and then 24/7 cable news, which always has to create and scoop up drama and get you excited to keep your eyes glued. And then you have social media and the internet age. And those things, too, profit off of our being outraged and profit about getting us to pay attention to things that aren't really relevant to us. So we're spending a lot of our time and mental energy worrying about some incident that happened in Poughkeepsie or Tallahassee, when we could be spending our time talking to our neighbors about what's actually happening right here in Des Moines. And so that's one of these effects, and we talked about a couple of the other ones, but there's also this idea of dehumanization that when somebody else is just this set of pixels and you don't have to look them in the eyeballs and share a physical space with them, it's easy to think of them as something less than a person, and think of them as just their opinions, and think of yourself as just your opinions. And then finally, because of all of those things, there's a lack of nuance in our thinking. And so the solution that is proposed by the Lyceum is to get in a room together and talk face to face with our neighbors about the big questions of human life. You can next. And so that's what it is. As Sean described, it's lectures, classes, discussion groups, and facilitated conversations. So you'd be with your neighbors in small groups across demographic lines, discussing these ideas that you normally would consume through YouTube or Twitter or whatever, or that many people would. And then the idea too is that it's not a place to go and eat vegetables and take classes, but it's a place, imagine like a rowdy town hall or like a tavern in the Revolutionary War. It's a place to enjoy with your neighbors and get together and explore ideas in that kind of atmosphere. So this is the general shape of how it works. You get a diverse set of neighbors who are across demographic and partisan and class lines. You get them into a room together for these lectures, debates, and classes on history, philosophy, art, and local government. So the kind of things that people sit and think about when they're driving around or mowing the lawn or whatever. We don't have anybody to talk to about it. And then you put those people in conversation with each other around those ideas that we all hold in common in a social atmosphere, and what you get out of it is a shared language. And what that means is a lot of times, when we do talk, we use these words like liberty or equality or fairness or whatever, and I have an idea of what that means, and you have an idea of what that means, but they're likely not the same idea. And so we can't have a productive conversation because we're speaking different languages. So it's an opportunity to come together and come to terms with each other in a literal way. And then a shared frame of reference. We also have to be able to be looking at the same world together to talk productively. And that means understanding our own local history, where this place came from, who its personas are, what its historical events are, what's going on now, so that we have points that we can triangulate when we talk about things. And then those two things conduce to community solutions. So it is learning about these subjects, but it's also a chance to get together and talk where we don't have a venue for talking about things that affect our community. And so to have those skills to be able to actually get together and talk in a way that allows us to act practically about, say, the quality of the water in the Des Moines River. And then ultimately, it's an opportunity through the practice of this thing of engaging in these ideas with your neighbors to develop those virtues and qualities of excellence that make it possible to be a citizen in a government that has participation in self-government, I'll say. And then the outcome of that, the desired outcome, is the common good, the lifting up of this whole city, the lifting up of the tenor of its thinking and its conversation, and then through that, stronger social bonds, and through that, practical results that will improve the community. Okay. These are a couple events that I'll say. You can go to the next one too, Kitty, just to make more sense of those two posters. What's next for Des Moines? The aim with this is to root it in Des Moines as it was rooted in the public forum movement. And the suspicion is that people actually haven't changed all that much in Des Moines since the 30s. And that there's still energy for this, and that Des Moines can still be a leader in this way. And so it's the idea is to be headquartered here, and then from there to grow it wider. And so we've had a couple of these kind of beta testing events in Minnesota and Louisiana and Kansas and a couple other places. So what's coming next for Des Moines is now kind of building this together in a full-time way, is hosting lectures, panels, and community conversations, building this culture that gets people out to do this, and then having these groups where people can continue to do it outside of the Lyceum. Our first event, this is what's on the poster, is on November 11th. You'll see it's, like Sean mentioned, after 100 years hiatus, it's coming back. And the question is Iowa Nice a real thing? what does that term mean? How do we understand that? What does it say about our identity? Is it something we live up to? Is it a moral standard that we should live up to? Those are the kinds of questions we'll talk about. We have Rochelle Chase, historian, Lynn Ta, who reports on Des Moines, and Scott Sipker, who I'm sure many of you are familiar with. So we can go to the next one. So yeah, that's the event that's coming up, and it will first have kind of those speakers sharing their perspectives and their unique expertise, and then breaking into conversation with one another. Long term, the goal is to become the go-to venue in the city for community conversation and lifelong learning. So to be that thing that the Lyceum was founded to be, which is we have a place to go and develop our bodies. There's gyms everywhere. We have places to shop. We have places to do all kinds of things, but we don't have a place to think together as a community. And so that's what the Lyceum would like to be, a place where the city comes together to do its thinking. And to that end, the goal is to require a Lyceum building or a Lyceum hall. And then one kind of goal coming up in the future is to take this different way of talking. And since you have these political candidates coming into Des Moines, to have them, as the place where Des Moines does its thinking, to have those political candidates come and be taken to a deeper level, not to the sound bites, but to talk about philosophy and value. In doing that, to kind of get underneath this level of discourse, which is actually not productive. All right, hopefully I did not go over long there, but this is the Des Moines Lyceum. I think it would be lovely to see all of you at the event on November 11th. And you can register, the link is kind of cut off at the bottom, but you can register at www.lyceummovement.org. And yeah, stay engaged, follow along, and I'm happy to take any questions.
So is there a national movement going on too, or is this just?
The question is there a national movement going on? This is it.
Who's putting up the money to help support this whole idea? Because you don't go through a presentation like this or a thought process with the goal of building a building and all kinds of other stuff, unless there's a little bit of financial backing involved. Could you talk a little bit about the financial components of how this is getting kicked off? Who's involved with that?
Yeah, so the question was, where is the funding coming from for this? I have right now a small seed grant from the organization Lead for America, which is a nonprofit that runs fellowships to get young leaders to return to their hometowns and work on whatever their town's most pressing challenges are. So it's a community development organization that has that strategy of taking somebody who might go to New York or Chicago or whatever and saying, come back home and your community needs you. And so in line kind of with that community development goal, they've given me a small bit of funding, and that's basically the starting point right now. And the goal is to kind of get more buy-in as time goes on, and then be able to get to a place where we can fund that building and whatnot. And also to, through, as things get going, through a strategy of earned revenue through events, so that it's not merely dependent on philanthropy.
Why isn't the music included?
Well, it actually would be included under the heading of art. Music, you asked? Yeah, why isn't music included? Music was a big part of the Lyceum historically, and you have kind of different levels of Lyceums. In a small town, it might just be somebody performing on their violin, some neighbor performing on their violin or whatever. But in this overall kind of heading of philosophy, art, culture, government, music would be included.
So these forums are meant to bring together thoughts and debate different controversial ideas with different people in the room that might have differing opinions. How do you keep it respectful without it degrading into something that isn't?
Yeah. So the question was, how do you keep it respectful if you're bringing people debating these controversial ideas coming from different perspectives? The strategy of the Lyceum is that it's actually not approaching the hot button issues. It's actually not talking about hot topics. The aim of it is to go what we call pre-political. So to talk about those ideas that we use later on in political discussions. So that was that thing about, we might refer to ideas about justice or to historical examples of these things when we talk about politics. And to be able to do that fruitfully, we have to have an understanding of what those words mean and of what the actual history is. And you get that through philosophy, and you also get it through history, and you get it through art and all kinds of different means. And so that's the level at which the Lyceum approaches it.
Help me with the name and where it comes from.
Yeah, that's a good question. The Lyceum, so Josiah Holbrook stole the name. I stole it from Josiah. Josiah stole it from Aristotle. In ancient Athens, there were two schools where you could learn philosophy, two main famous schools. There was Plato's Academy and Aristotle's Lyceum. And Plato's Academy, interestingly, Plato's Academy was all about abstraction and mathematics, and it was a building. And the Lyceum, Aristotle's Lyceum, was outdoors, and it was a place to try to come more into contact with concrete reality. So that's kind of some of the spiritual inspiration for that Lyceum thing is it's a place to get in touch with reality with your neighbors.
Is there a strategy to get these people of differing viewpoints all in the same room? And how do you recruit, say, from both sides or from opposite sides?
And you can let me know, or Kitty, if I'm getting close to time or anything. So the question was, how do you recruit people from across these differences, demographic or political or otherwise? And the strategy is basically to start building connections with community shepherds or community leaders. So there are people within these different circles of the community right now who are points of influence within their circles. And so to try to start to get those people talking to each other and agreeing around this idea of a more humane way of talking and learning, and then by that means have them kind of incorporate their distinct circles. And then the goal is, once we get into a room and talk to each other, we realize that there are a lot of things that we have in common.
What in your mind is the difference between the Lyceum movement and the Chautauqua movement?
So the question was, what's the difference between the Lyceum and the Chautauqua movement? And the Chautauqua movement, if you're not familiar with it, was also kind of in the late 19th, early 20th century. And it was a movement. They used to have them in waterworks, I think, here. And you would have this Chautauqua week, and there'd be a big festival in the park, and you'd get together and you would hear musicians and speakers and performers and things like that. So a lot of times the Lyceum and the Chautauqua kind of blurred into each other historically. The Chautauqua difference, I would say, was it had more of a religious element. It was run through the mainline Protestant churches. And then it also was a little bit more arts focused, whereas the Lyceum had more of this focus on, or more of this element of philosophy and government and history and things like that.
Is there an optimum size for a Lyceum?
It depends on the size of the community. So you could have a small Lyceum. There are instances, if you're a small town, it could be meeting in somebody's living room and kind of putting it on yourself. If you're in a mid-sized town, it could be an event like this one we have coming up. And then the goal, if you're in a city that could support it, would be to have this venue where people could come together consistently, and it would just be open, and you could come and you could eat and drink and talk about ideas. So really, I think it's adaptable to whatever size. All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Nathan, for your presentation today, but also for bringing your enthusiasm and thoughtfulness back to Des Moines. We are a better city because of it. So on behalf of Nathan and his presentation, we are donating a book to our Rotary Rosie Reader Van. Through the Des Moines Public Library Foundation. As you probably recall, they were the recipient of our $40,000 community grant last year, and so we are coordinating with them to expand the impact of that foundation gift. And so beginning this month, as we did last week, this is how we will be donating our books each week. Coming up, we have some great programs on our lineup. Next week, we have Aaron Putsey. He is a speaker and author and a Waukee Rotarian, and he will be talking in part about leadership based on his interviews with 27 leaders across the state of Iowa. The following week, November 4th, we have Alicia Knapp. She is with BHE Renewables. This is a program that was rescheduled from earlier in the year. And then November 11th is Veterans Day, and we will have Quilts of Valor. And we will be meeting at the River Center on that date, and more information and reminders will be coming about that. So with that, thank you so much for being with us today and for being a part of Rotary Club of Des Moines. We are adjourned.